So that's where we'll go. But first, where are we in the story of Jesus' life at Mark 14, the end of 14? What has happened before?
They're celebrating the Passover.
Okay. They have celebrated the Passover. And what do they do after the Passover?
Last Supper.
Okay, that's part of the Passover. That was,
Yeah.
that was.
We've entered into the trials. There's 6 trials.
Okay,
And he's seeing, and, yeah, the Sanhedrin.
okay, yeah, so the Jewish religious ruling organizations. And there are several components of that. But we'll probably, well, we've already gone through the, let's see, I'm trying to get my head about last week and what I was studying this week, so I'm getting confused. So one of the things that Jesus did during that Passover meal, supper time, was predicted his what?
His crucifixion.
Betrayal. Yeah.
Yes, his betrayal, his death. So we really need to look at that because that sets the stage for what we're studying today at the end of 14. So let's go back. I've got I believe it's, yeah, let's go back. Do we all have Mark 14 open? We need to be there. We need to read into that. If somebody will read 27 through 31.
I got it.
Okay.
And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." But Peter said to him, "Even though all may fall away, yet I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows twice, you yourself will deny me 3 times." But Peter kept saying insistently, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And they all were saying the same thing also.
And just for effect, I'm going to read John's version of this in 13. Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you." And Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times." And you noticed in Mark, they were all saying the same thing. He's saying he's going to die, and they were all very adamant. They are not going to, that's not going to faze them. They will stand by him. So let's go to verse 66, Mark 14, and let's see how this actually happens. As Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servants' girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, You also were with Jesus the Nazarene." But he denied it. "I neither know him nor understand what you are talking about." And he went out. So do you get the sense here? What has happened between the confident statements and this point.
Jesus was taken. The leader was gone.
He was arrested. The religious group that was instigating this had also brought government soldiers with them. So this was a very secure state that Jesus was in. And the disciples were not really capable of resisting this too much. But let's go back to verse 47. And we saw this last week. Somebody want to read verse 47?
Got it. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear.
Okay, so how do you swing your sword to cut off somebody's ear?
In a downward motion.
You're aiming for their neck.
Yes, but he wasn't, the guy didn't stand there and let him chop off his ear like he was chopping wood. Peter was probably swinging sideways for his neck, and the guy was just fast enough, and all he got was his ear. Pretty amazing stuff. So this was Peter. So he was not denying Jesus here, was he? He was defending him. Of course, you will say, how do we know it was Peter? How do we know it's Peter?
Because it says.
Yeah, John has a whole lot more detail than Mark does. Mark is giving a brief description here. As you know, the last half of John, 12 chapters are devoted to Jesus' last week. If we go to John 18, we see this moment. John 18:10, Simon Peter then, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And here he even gives the slave's name, Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So how did Jesus respond to Peter's defense there?
That it wasn't necessary.
Yeah.
Wasn't even wanted, because Jesus had to go through this. So you're in front of hundreds of Roman soldiers and you take a swing at one of the group. How are you going to feel about that when you miss? So we need to be a little gracious, more than a little gracious to Peter. He really did try. He tried wrongly, perhaps, but he really did try. And then being told to not do that, it would be really deflating to your reasoning, certainly to your ego. And actually, if you're in front of all these soldiers that you're swinging in their direction, wouldn't you have a little fear for your own safety at that point?
Hey, Jerry.
Yes, sir.
Last week we noted the mercy and compassion of Jesus in healing Malchus's ear. He was also merciful to Peter in that too, because as we looked at last week, the crime for killing somebody was death, right? Capital punishment. And so Jesus told him right after that, you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Right.
And so Jesus was not only looking out for Malchus, but he was looking out for Peter too, and killing Malchus's ear there.
Yes, in retrospect, we can see all of this was all compassion for everyone, all mankind, including us. So Mark 14:50 gives the punchline at this point. Somebody want to read that? Or we should all read it, but anyway. Anyway, at this point, they all left him and fled. So they didn't hang around. Peter was the only one that actually made an effort at defending him. And after that, they all left him. So at this point, we go during the trials, which we went through the first three last week, the religious system trials of the chief priests, the elders, and the council. This took place probably over a 3 or 4, maybe more hour period of time, where Jesus was in front of these people, but he's restrained by, he was captured, he was bound by the government troops, but they were party to the religious leaders. The religious leaders were driving the bus at this time, and they went through these 3 different trials. And that's what is happening during this period of time here, where we are in Mark. So when we look at the description of her accusation here in verse 67, do you notice anything about the girl's description?
Servant girl
Yes.
of the high priest.
Yep. She was an employee of the high priest, and the high priest was the one that's bringing these charges against and doing the running the trial and being the judge and partially the jury at the same time. So how does she describe Jesus here?
As a Nazarene. And she looked at Peter and then realized that he was with Jesus, the Nazarene. So identifying where he came from.
Yeah, so Mark, again, most of Mark's up to this point occurs in Galilee, and so I don't know where this Nazarene label got affixed to him, but it certainly associated him with the north. But she recognized Peter as being with Jesus, so it's possible she saw him in some of the other
Disciples.
well, I was saying when Jesus had other confrontations in the temple, because he'd been in the temple a lot, so yes, it would not be surprising that she would recognize the disciples, and certainly Peter. Any other thoughts at this point? He uses 2 negatives in denying it. He says, I neither know nor understand what you are talking about. He's trying to distance himself really far, and plus he leaves to distance himself.
Yeah, it's interesting. He says, I don't understand what you're talking about, but I think clearly he does know what she's talking about. He's just like, no, it's like what you said, he's trying to get far away as he can from the situation.
other comments? We've all read this 1,000 times in our lifetimes, so.
How do you think they knew that he was a Galilean? Or did I?
I'll let somebody smarter comment on that. Jesus was raised in the north, so it's possible that he picked up a dialect from
He had a
there,
northern accent?
possibly so. Although he's perfect, so I would think he
Jesus
would
was
have
a Yankee.
he would have had perfect Aramaic. So I would think he probably wouldn't have an accent being perfect, because I think an accent is a typical of fallen language, where you learn to talk a little different.
Subtle dress differences, maybe, and stuff.
In my New King James Version, in verse 70, when she asks, "Surely you are a Galilean," it says with a comma, "and your speech shows it." So it was his speech that signaled to her where he came from.
Well, that's where Peter came from, and yes, we would certainly say all of that's true of Peter, but we were wondering why Jesus was labeled the Nazarene. But I think that just means that people knew a lot more about people. There was a lot more human interaction, and people depended on people to be truthful and honest, because you were always around the same people, and if you get a reputation of inaccurate speech or that's the best way I could put it, exaggerating. We know people like that. They tend to overstate things or understate things. But there, when you don't have near much access to written documentations, pretty much all you get is what you hear. And so people were much more disciplined in hearing and speaking than we will ever be, because we depend on written things that we intake, and we aren't careful to capture that accurately. So whenever we give a book report or a comment on something we witnessed, we are far less accurate than we should be. We need to take more care with our speech. Memorization is becoming very rare in our culture. We just don't expect people to give totally accurate information when we speak anymore, because we don't spend that much time getting it and making sure that we have it right when we say it. Sir?
As you alluded to, Jesus, he's been around by now, so everybody knows who he is. This wasn't his first time in or around the temple. Even all the way back in the beginning of Mark, he had already acquired a great deal of fame. In Matthew 2, it talks about how Jesus was from Egypt. He'd be called up out of Egypt, and he'd be called a Nazarene. Matthew 2:23 says, he came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. So the fact that he was called a Nazarene, this has prophetic importance. And in Mark 1, the demon talking to Jesus says to him, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth?" So it has prophetic importance, and even the demons had this title that was associated with him as being the Holy One of God, he says in that same sentence, the demon does. And so it seems like even this unbelieving slave girl has some kind of understanding of who Jesus is, and the fact that Peter was associated with him.
Yeah, very good. That's exactly right. Yeah. It would have been common knowledge. And to see that she used that label is very significant, considering, yes, that is prophetic label for him. So another evidence that Jesus was the Messiah, just from this, one of the lowest people in the culture, even she knew that. That's very impressive. Yes, so there are, how many times did Peter deny Jesus in this sequence? 3 times. And why would we say that? Because that's what Jesus predicted. Okay, so that was the first time. Let's go on. Would someone please read 69?
The servant girl saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them."
Go ahead and read 70.
But again he denied it, and after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too."
Okay, so that's definitely clear that he was Galilean by just by the way he speaks. And we generally can tell when someone's from the South or when somebody's from New York or Boston and New England, but people who study this can really determine that there are dialects, accents, the way we speak can be determined with lots and lots and lots of places around our country. So our speech does give us away. I have not lived in the East since 1960, 70 was the last time I was there. And occasionally people still say, "You're not from here."
That's not all due to your speech, though.
Pardon?
That's not all due to your speech, though.
Oh, really? I'm sorry. Logan, I ignored you earlier. What were you going to say? Do you still remember?
No, I was just thinking about Peter and the peer pressure he had. He's the one that showed up down here in this courtyard. I mean, he's following him. Give him credit for that.
Yeah.
He came back and standing around there warming his hands up, it says, with the other guys probably, the bystanders. And he had a lot of peer pressure. And we could talk about peer pressure in around us, in our job setting maybe,
Yep.
or whatever we do for work, or just, we get a lot around here. And we should get more. As Christians, we should stand out more. But I just wonder, what would have happened if he would have affirmed that he was an apostle? I just gotta wonder. Would have they killed him alongside of Jesus? I guess we don't know.
We don't know.
Probably what Peter was afraid of. Afraid for his life, I'm sure.
Well, and the soldiers and stuff were there when they cut off his hair, they're like, keep an eye on him, he's volatile one.
Well, yes, after swinging that sword, it would be reasonable, very reasonable, since Jesus didn't support that, you'd want to get distance between that particular crowd. That was the front of the group. But yes, Jesus had already been grabbed when he did that. So, yeah, it's curious that they didn't pursue him, really. It really is. But when you're a soldier in full armor, you're probably not too concerned about some dude that didn't know how to use a sword.
You might be good at chopping wood, but.
Exactly. They probably weren't afraid of him, and they had already been intimidated by Jesus saying, "I am." So they were off of their mindset too for a little bit there.
They're trying to rush everything
Yes.
along because they're worried about the crowds. When people show up in the temple in the morning, they're wanting to avoid the masses, not just Peter.
Yeah, so maybe it was even the high priest that just told him to ignore him and let's get this guy down to trial. So then I didn't have you read 71. Peter began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Those words probably rang in his ears for a while later. But, I always thought this meant he was using profanity to show that he wasn't related to Jesus. But my reading says that probably means he was taking an oath. He was swearing on but I wasn't there, and so I don't know. But that was the other option, that he was binding himself under an oath that what he was saying was true, when in fact, of course, it wasn't. And then, immediately, a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." So we don't have each of the 3 denials in this section, but if we find that in John. But he then had remorse. So it's interesting, the rooster crowing the first time didn't jog his memory, but then the second time it did. And in it's interesting that Luke uses the same words. He went out and wept bitterly. Another thing I did forget to mention is that one of the other accusers, who was a slave of the high priest, it says in John, was a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off. "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" I doubt that Peter would have known that at the time, since John records that.
Did you say that was Malchus that said that to Peter?
No, that was a relative of Malchus.
Oh,
So,
I just thought that'd be funny if it was Malchus himself. I don't think you could forget Peter.
that would be funny. Okay, so what we got here, Peter went out and wept. He wept bitterly. So what do we see here? We see remorse. Who else had remorse about this whole situation? Yes.
Right.
And where do we see that?
In the Bible.
Yeah, I had that all in my notes, but they didn't get with me now. I was thinking it was Matthew's account. That's right, 27:3. When they saw, and when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse. He went and returned, pardon?
27 what?
3.
3?
That's where he goes and throws the money back at the chief priests and elders. He says, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. So he, up until this time, Jesus had evaded all attempts to do him in. When he was in his hometown, they took him up on top of a hill to throw him down because they were mad at him for criticizing them for not accepting their Messiah. But he just walked away and went through, and they lost him there. And all these times that he was in the temple, he turned over the money changers' tables and chased out the animals that they had in there. But no one touched him. So Judas, I am speculating, thought, he could have his cake and eat it too. He could make some money on this deal, and Jesus would just walk away again. But again, he isn't listening to what Jesus is saying, that he is going to be crucified. But when this happens, he realizes that he's been mistaken. But what's the difference between he and Peter?
Jesus doesn't deny who he is.
Well, the difference is they both had remorse. One,
According to the will of God.
well, yes, exactly. 2 Corinthians 7:10. There's two kinds of remorse. Like Jesus said, the demons fear and they tremble. We need to fear God, but we bow before him. We recognize our guilt, and we hope and pray and trust that there is forgiveness for that. Mr. Judas did not look for any forgiveness. Someone have 2 Corinthians?
Yeah, I got it. Says, so 2 Corinthians 7:10 says, for the sorrow that is according to the will of God produces the repentance without regret, leading to salvation, but the sorrow of the world produces death.
Yeah, there's two ways you can go when you discover your guilt. When we discover our guilt, there's two things we can do. We can be hopeless, and we know there's an awful lot of that going on right now. People are not looking for, expecting, or maybe even believing that there can be forgiveness. And so that's what the whole meaning of the good news is. The good message is that there is forgiveness. And even to the point, what greater sin is there than betraying the Son of God, or betraying or denying him? What possibly could be greater than that? Especially for someone who's been with him for 3 years, seeing all the miracles, even seeing people being brought back to life. It takes the Spirit of God to give us the possibility of hoping that there's forgiveness. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm also wondering, what Judas was really wanting to get out of this. Do you think it's speculation that it was just money, or, because I think Judas, he also was kind of Rome, like overthrow the Roman Empire and be king. But, I mean, clearly I don't think he was planning on Jesus to die with this, because, yeah, we see his remorse, so, like, I don't know, did you have any insight on that too, Tyler? Or do you think it's all just, 'cause I've never understood that.
Yeah, I think it's more than just money. I think money certainly plays a part into it, but remember that Satan entered into Judas, so there's both a spiritual aspect too. And Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas was never one of his. He was told in John that he would never lose any of those who were given to him, but Judas wasn't one of those who was given to him, so he was never truly a believer. Satan entered into him. All along he was operating by his own selfish, sinful desires, stealing from money bags. So you can't just isolate and say, well, it was only his sin, it was only his flesh, or the influence of the world, or it was only Satan. I think it's all three of those main influences working together: the sin, the world, Satan, but ultimately it's God in His providence who orchestrated even this terrible disaster, the crucifixion of the Holy One. That was all by God's predestinated plan.
So that's the difference, and that's what we have to encourage ourselves when we act like Peter, and also everybody else around us. There is forgiveness. The only thing that we can need to tell is that Jesus died for that, and so that sin is paid in full, and it's for the sin of the whole world. So no one needs to claim they're excluded. So in your heading, you included the restoration of Peter. So I concluded that we were supposed to cover that at this point too.
Yes, I think it'd be good.
Well, it would be
John
good.
21?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that how Jesus responds to Peter afterwards. We need to see that is the most important thing for us, is to see how Jesus responded to Peter. And he responded to him at the cock crowing, first of all. And it just says that, if I could remember where that is, which I can't. I thought I had that written down. But one of the Gospels says that when he said that the third time, that Jesus looked at him, and he looked at Jesus. He remembered, he looked at Jesus, and Jesus was looking at him. So that would, the moment of truth there. And so Peter wept. He was remorseful, but he didn't kill himself. He didn't run back home never to be seen again. So we need to look and see what happens after that. So let's go to Mark 16. We'll go ahead a little bit here just to tie that in. Mark 16. After the women went there and saw the angel, they went back. In fact, the angel told them to go back. I'll read verse 5 and 7. Entering the tomb, the women saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just like he told you. So that's what the angel told. They told the women to go back and tell the disciples and Peter. So that was Jesus' instruction to the angel to definitely tell Peter, make sure he knows. And isn't that just really cool? And then in Matthew records Matthew doesn't. Luke records that that Jesus appeared to Simon. That was when the 11 were gathered in the upper room. But John tells us, of course, the most. So that's where we shall spend the rest of our time. So let's go to John 20. So again, John 20 starts with the women, Mary Magdalene, going to the tomb early and saw the stone taken away. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said to them. So it's interesting, right away, and another thing we didn't note before is that when Peter entered the court, one of the Gospels says that John was there already because he had to come and vouch for Peter to bring him into the courtyard. So Peter and John were together in the courtyard for a bit. And so here we see them, on the resurrection morning, that Peter and John were together again, or still. So John was a witness to what happened with Peter's denials. And so that's another cool thing. John didn't abandon Peter either. So Mary Magdalene came to them, and so that's when Peter and John went running to the tomb. And it's really cool to see Peter. He wasn't as fast as John, but he wasn't careful either. In verse...
They made me think too, was he a little hesitant? Like John,
on running.
John was the first one there.
Well, the two were running together. The other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first, and stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. And so verse 6, Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb. So he just wasn't going to,
Just wasn't his time.
yeah.
A little bit more pudgy.
So he still did not understand, it says, but in verse 8, the other disciple who had come first to the tomb then also entered. He saw and believed. So John had his moment of belief when he saw the empty space there with the clothes. But Peter still may have a little bit of question because he did not understand the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So they went to their own homes. So moving on then to 21, verse 12. They are now in Galilee, and Jesus shows up there. The disciples are fishing, and Jesus shows up on the shore. We all know that story, I suppose. And John recognizes Jesus. Peter didn't. But as soon as he told Peter, what did Peter do?
Jumped in the water.
He jumped in the water and swam to Jesus. The only one that really had to see Jesus. Now, isn't this just amazing about Peter's character at this point? He, after what he had just done a couple of days before, and yet he still is committed to Jesus. In spite of himself, he's looking to Jesus. He sees in Jesus maybe more than what we see. He's totally committed to Jesus. And we see that more now, and yeah, it's just very amazing, to look at what happens in Acts after the filling of the Spirit. Peter is the one that gets up. And the amazing thing to me, after seeing all of this, seeing the fact that he used a sword, the only one to defend Jesus, and then was told to stop, and subsequently denied him 3 times, he's the one that stood up after being filled with the Spirit and preached directly to the crowd, some of which were there that had yelled, "Crucify him, crucify him." And we have to read this. It's just the most coolest statement that he made. Acts 2:22. Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. So he's no longer afraid. He's willing to tell Jesus' murderers that you did it. He apparently is not afraid anymore. Isn't that great? So somewhere in this line of serious denial and massive fearlessness, we all fall. Let's hope we get closer to that massive fearlessness. And we've certainly seen many, many people in history that have done that, and many today. Any other comments? Our time is up enough. I'm sure Tyler's got to say something.
Yeah, we've got to keep going in John 21 to 15 and following, right? When Jesus confronts Peter again. So it says in 15, so when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" I think he's pointing to not the other disciples, because I don't think he's like trying to bring up a competition between Peter and the disciples, but his fishing stuff that he went back to. Remember, Jesus told them, "You guys have a mission, right?" But they went back to fishing. They just went back to what they were doing before. And so I think Jesus is saying, "Do you love me more than this other stuff, than your fishing gear, than your career, than your money that you went back to?" And he said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." And he said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." And so just as he had denied him 3 times before, I think that Jesus is drawing him back and restoring him and giving him a commission to go out and to tend his sheep, to shepherd his lambs, to leave behind his life of fishing and to turn back to Jesus. Jesus is welcoming him back in, not only as a disciple, but as a future leader in the church, so he can stand up and part of that foundation of the prophets and apostles that the church is built upon.
Any other comments? That is the point. And he asks us the same, do we love him more than these things and this stuff and even these people? Jesus has to be first for us.
Just think it's interesting that elsewhere in Scripture it says that blessed are you who see, and yet those who do not see are even more blessed. So God is thinking, Jesus is thinking about the future, about us. And again, it goes right back to the entirety of the gospel that we don't change men's hearts. Can't convince by clever arguments or evidences. It has to be with the Holy Spirit.
Okay, go and tell. Thank you.
Right now.
You got 15 minutes, Joseph.